Good morning, students. Today we are going to learn about the spinal cord. So, in the previous classes, we have studied about the neurons and the nervous system. So, today let us see about the spinal cord. So, there are about 100 million neurons and a lot of neuroglia. So, spinal cord is made up of a lot of neurons and neuroglia, which we have studied in detail in the previous classes. Spinal cord is a part of the nervous system that extends from the brain. So it is continuous with the brain, and together with the brain, they comprise the central nervous system. The spinal cord and the spinal nerves contribute to homeostasis by providing quick reflexive responses to many stimuli. So, you would have experienced a lot of quick reflex actions in the environment. That is, when you are grasping some hot substances, we tend to drop it down immediately. By this is by reflex action. The grasping muscles may relax, and you may drop the hot object even before you realize, that is consciously aware of the heat or the pain you experience. So this is called as the reflex action. So the spinal cord is associated with a lot of spinal nerves, contain neural circuits that control these rapid reactions to the environmental changes. So we have to study in detail about the spinal cord and the spinal nerves associated with them. The spinal cord is a pathway for sensory input into the brain and also the motor input from the brain. So, this we have studied about the sensory neurons, interneurons, and the motor neurons in the previous classes. So, this is the main pathway. Spinal cord is the pathway for sensory input into the brain and also motor output from the brain. You would have studied about tract. Okay, the tract which passes through the vertebral column and the spinal cord and reaches the brain, okay, which will inform the brain about the happenings. That is, the sensory neurons will give the input to the brain about what is happening in the physiological system, and the brain will give orders through the motor neurons. So the spinal cord and the spinal nerve contain neural circuits that control the most rapid reactions to the environmental changes. So, what is a spinal reflex? A spinal cord reflex is a quick automatic response to certain kind of stimuli that involves neurons only in the spinal nerve and the spinal cord, which does not involve the brain. So, the quick kind of stimuli that involve the neurons of the spinal nerve and the spinal cord is called as the spinal reflex. So, besides processing the reflexes, that is, they have to process the reflex, the gray matter of the spinal cord is also a site for integration. That is, to find out what is actually happening and summing of the excitatory postsynaptic potentials and also the inhibitory postsynaptic potentials. The white matter of the spinal cord contain a dozen major sensory and the motor tracts, which act as highways along which sensory inputs travel to the brain through tracts, and motor output travels from the brain to the skeletal muscles and other effector regions. So you can say that the spinal cord is continuous with the brain, and together they make up the central nervous system. Let us see the anatomy of the spinal cord. So the spinal cord, just like the brain, has some protective structures. So the nervous tissue of the central nervous system is delicate, and it is protected by from damage or injury. It is not very easily damaged. So the nervous tissue also requires considerable amount of protection. So you can see the protective layer. So the first layer, the external layer of the protection is provided by the bony skull and the vertebral column. So this is the first layer of protection from the central nervous system. It is the hard bony skull and the vertebral column. The skull encases the brain. The brain is present inside the skull, and the vertebral column surrounds the spinal cord throughout the body. So, these provide strong protective defenses against damages or some blows or some accident or something. The second protective layer, you can see, it is the meninges. It is a tough connective tissue. It's a tough connective tissue. They are called as the meninges. There are three meninges that lie in between the bony encasement, outer encasement, and the nervous tissue of both the brain and the spinal cord. So this is the second layer of protective structure. The third layer is the cushion of cerebrospinal fluid. So this is a fluid liquid produced in the brain. So this that is the space between the meningeal membrane contain the cerebrospinal fluid. So this fluid surrounds and protects the delicate nervous tissue of the spinal cord. So it acts as a shock absorber, like a hydraulic cushion, which in which the spinal cord is present and encased, and it is protected. So these are the three protective structures. What are the protective structures? The bony skull of the brain and the vertebral column that protects the spinal cord. Next layer is the inner layer is the meninges. There are three meninges which we are going to see in the next slide, and a cushion of cerebrospinal fluid which acts as a lubricator as well as an insulator, and also as a shock absorber or a cushion, you can say. The next protective structure is called as the vertebral column. So the spinal cord is located within the vertebral canal of the vertebral column. So where it is located? It is located within the vertebral canal of the vertebral column. So, the vertebral foramina, as we have learnt in the previous classes, it is the opening of all the vertebrae are stacked one on top of the other, form the vertebral canal. So, what is a vertebral canal? The vertebrae are stacked one on top of the other. That you can see, you can call it as a disc. So the surrounding vertebrae provides a sturdy shelter for the enclosed spinal cord. The cord is enclosed in the center of the vertebral canal. So this vertebrae provides a shelter and a protective layer for the spinal cord. The vertebral ligaments, meninges, and the cerebrospinal fluid provide additional protection. Now we will see about the meninges. So there are three protective connective tissue coverings that encircle the spinal cord and the brain. They are called as the meninges. So you can say this is continuous. The spinal meninges surround the spinal cord and are continuous with the cranial meninges which encircle the brain. So the meninges are continuous with the brain and the spinal cord. So the meninges which are surrounding the spinal cord is called as the spinal meninges, and which encircle the brain is called as the cranial meninges. So, what are the three types of meninges? The first one is the dura mater, the second one is the arachnoid mater, and the third one is the pia. So, the dura mater is the outermost covering. The center one is called as the arachnoid mater, and the innermost one is called as the pia mater. So the spinal meninges surround the spinal cord and are continuous with the cranial meninges. So this you have to remember. So the most superficial of the three meninges, that is the outermost one, is called as the dura mater. It is composed of dense irregular connective tissue. You can see the picture in the next slide. It forms a sac from the level of the foramen magnum in the brain, in the occipital bone, where it is continuous with the dura mater of the brain to the second sacral vertebrae. So this is a continuous one with the dura mater of the brain. So spinal cord is also protected. So there is a space that is protected by the cushion of fat and connective tissue located in the epidural space between the dura mater and the wall of the vertebral column. So the spinal cord is protected by a cushion of fat and connective tissue, which is located in the epidural space. This is the space between the dura mater and the wall of the vertebral canal. So this space is filled with some kind of cushion of fat and connective tissue, and it acts as a protective layer. The center one, the middle one, it is called as meninges or menings singular. It is a vascular covering called the arachnoid matter. You spell it as arachnoid matter because it is having a spider web like arrangement of delicate. What is it made up of? It is made up of delicate collagen fibers and some elastic fibers. So it is present inner to the dura mater, and this is also continuous with the arachnoid matter of the brain. Between the dura mater and the arachnoid matter, again there is a space, subdural space, which contains the interstitial fluid. So between two meninges, there is some space which is filled with some fluid. The innermost meninx is the biomatter. So it is a thin, transparent connective tissue layer that adheres to the surface of the spinal cord and the brain. Just it covers the spinal cord and the brain. This is the innermost layer. What is it made up of? It consists of squamous to cuboidal cells within interlacing bundles of collagen fibers and some fine elastic fibers. So it is made up of squamous to cuboidal cells within interlacing bundles of collagen fibers and some fine elastic fibers. So what does this contain? Within this parameter, there are many blood vessels that supply oxygen and nutrients to the spinal cord. So this is what is the the role of the spinal pyomet. Between the arachnoid matter and the pyomatter, again, there is a subarachnoid space. Between the arachnoid matter and pyomatter, there is a subarachnoid space which contains the cerebrospinal fluid, as we have seen earlier, that serves as a shock absorber and a suspension system for the spinal cord and the brain. Now let us study about the anatomy of the spinal cord. So you can see the anatomy of the spinal cord. It is roughly oval in shape. You can see it is oval in shape. You can see the structure of the spinal cord, and it is flattened slightly anteriorly and posteriorly. There is a small flattening. So you can see this is the anterior side or the ventral side, and this is the posterior side or the dorsal side. You call it as the anterior front or the posterior behind, okay, the back. And you can see this is the gray matter which is in the shape of the butterfly, and externally you can see the white matter. So this is the some fissure. This is called as the anterior median fissure, and this is the posterior sulcus. This is the posterior sulcus. This is the anterior median fissure which goes inside, and this is the posterior median sulcus. Then you can see these are the meninges. You can see three layers of meninges. Spinal meninges. The innermost layer is the pyomatter, and the middle layer is called as the arachnoid matter, and the outermost layer is called as the dura mater. So in between these meninges, there are some spaces called as the subarachnoid space. See, you can see here subarachnoid space. It is the space in between this second layer and arachnoid matter and the pyomatter. And another space called as the subdural space, the space between the dura mater and the arachnoid matter. So these are the spaces which is filled with the fluid or the cerebrospinal fluid and connective fat tissue layer, etc. There is another blue colored thing, you can call it, as you can see, it is a denticulate ligaments. So they are extensions, okay, they are thickenings of the pyometer. So these are extensions and thickenings of the pyometer. They protect laterally and fuse with the arachnoid matter and the inner surface of the dura mater between the anterior and posterior nerve roots of the spinal nerves on either side. You can see this is the spinal nerve which is coming out. There are different 31 pairs of spinal nerves present that we will see in the next slides. Okay, so this is the denticulate ligament. So this is the thickening, that is the pyometer, the thickening of the pyometer, which is extensions. So they project laterally and they fuse with the arachnoid matter, you can see, and the inner surface of the dura mater. So that is what they give a structural support to the spinal cord and the vertebral column. So this is what the triangular shaped membranous extensions of the pyomatter suspend the spinal cord in the middle of its dural sheath. So these triangular shaped extensions are called as the denticulate ligaments. So they are the thickening of the pyometer. They project laterally and fuse with the arachnoid matter and inner surface of the dura mater between the anterior and the posterior nerve roots of the spinal nerves on either side. So we will see what is the anterior root, what is the posterior nerve root. Okay, we will all see in the next few slides. So extending all along the length of the spinal cord, the denticulate ligaments protect the spinal cord against sudden shock, okay, sudden displacement because of some shock. So the denticulate ligaments are very, very important. They are extending throughout the length of the spinal cord, and they protect the spinal cord from shock. So here in this picture, you can see the denticulate ligament. This shows the denticulate ligament. This is the occipital bone. It extends from the occipital bone to the posterior. So these are the rootlets of the spinal cord. We will study about roots and rootlets in the next slide. This is the posterior median sulcus, vertebral artery, and the different nerves. This is the dura mater. So these are the denticulate ligaments. So here you can see the different spaces. You can see the dura mater and the arachnoid matter, the spinal cord in the center, the pyomatter which is just the innermost covering of the spinal cord, and you can see the epidural space. This is the posterior rhamnus of the spinal nerve, and this is the spinal nerve which is coming out of the spinal cord is the spinal nerve. This is the this is the posterior part of the dorsal the root of the spinal nerve, and this is the anterior root of the spinal nerve. So this is the vertebral artery in transverse foramen. These transverse foramens are very important because there is the root of the nerves come out of the foramen. Foramens are openings. So you can see the transverse foramen, and here you can see just like here, anterior root of the spinal cord. This is the anterior root of the spinal cord which comes out of the rhamnus of the spinal nerve. And here you can see the denticulate ligament and the subarachnoid space and other things. Let us study about the external anatomy of the spinal cord. So I think you can see this picture clearly. Let us study about what are the anatomy of the spinal cord. So spinal cord is, as we have seen, is oval in shape. It is flattened as slightly, in the anteriorly as well as the posteriorly by the structures. The anterior fissure. You can call it as the anterior fissure and the posterior sulcus. So these are the structures. So in adults, this extends from the medulla oblongata. So you can see the medulla oblongata here. It extends from the medulla oblongata, and there is a last part of the brain that is a superior to the superior border of the lumbar. You can see the lumbar. Thoracic, lumbar, and the sacral regions. It extends up to the coccyx. Okay, the end of the coccygeal nerves, coccyx. You can see here. So whereas as a young infant is born, as he grows in size, the vertebral column also extends and grows. So in newly born infants, it extends to the third or fourth lumbar vertebrae. You can see the lumbar vertebrae, third or fourth lumbar vertebrae, and in the early childhood the spinal cord grows along with the vertebral column. Okay, as it will result as an overall growth of the body. So the elongation of the spinal cord stops around the sometime there is the age of 4 or 5, but the vertebral column keeps growing continuously. So the vertebral column does not extend the entire length. So you can see it does not extend the entire length of the adult vertebral column. So the length of the adult spinal cord ranges from 42 to 45 centimeter, and it has a diameter of 2 centimeter. Okay, so the diameter may vary. You can see that there is a difference in the diameter, some thickenings here. You can see these are some enlargements, cervical enlargement, and you can see the lumbar enlargements. So there are some enlargements. You can see conus, medullaris. So these are some enlargements. The diameter is not the same throughout. Okay, the diameter is not the same throughout, so it will differ. It sometimes as it comes down, you can see there are many hair like structures. It is not continuous. Okay, it will end in hair like structures. The lumbar nerves and the sacral nerves are in the form of hair like structures. So you can see there are the enlargement. The first enlargement is the cervical enlargement. This is the superior enlargement. Called as where does it extend? It extends from the fourth cervical vertebrae to the first thoracic vertebrae. So nerves to and from the upper limbs arise from the cervical enlargement. So these extend from the uh, fourth cervical vertebrae to the first thoracic vertebrae. So what does it give rise to? It gives rise to nerves. Nerves to and from the upper limbs arise from the cervical enlargement. The second enlargement is called as the inferior enlargement. Superior means upper and inferior means lower. It is called as the lumbar enlargement. It extends from the ninth to the 12th thoracic vertebrae. So this gives supplies nerves to and from the lower limbs. Okay, and you can see it arises from the lumbar region. Below this enlargement, there is lumbar enlargement. There is a tapering of the spinal cord. That is called as the uh, conus medullaris. Conus, the name itself, it is a conical structure. Okay, it ends at the level of the intervertebral disc between first and second lumbar vertebrae. See here it ends. Okay, first and second lumbar vertebrae. This is called as the conus medullaris. Okay, from the conus medullaris, you can see the phylum terminate. Okay, it ends in the phylum terminate. So you can see this is an extension of the biomatter that extends downwards and fuses with the arachnoid matter and the dura matter, and this anchors the spinal cord to the coccyx, to this region, coccyx. Okay, this is the structure. The three important regions are, that is the spinal cord. The length of the spinal cord may, in an adult person, it can be from 42 to 45 centimeter, and the diameter approximately it is 2 centimeter, but the diameter can vary at various parts of the vertebral column. There are two enlargements. One is the cervical enlargement, which starts from the fourth cervical vertebrae to the first thoracic vertebrae, and the second enlargement is the lumbar enlargement, where this will start from the ninth thoracic vertebrae to the 12th thoracic vertebrae. And there is another cone like structure called the conus medullaris, which extends up to the level of the phylum terminate, which anchors the spinal cord to the coccyx. Okay, to the coccyx. So this is the structure, and you can see various nerves. So these nerves we can study separately in the spinal nerves. Okay, but you have to understand there are 31 pairs of nerves, spinal nerves. So what are spinal nerves? They are the path or the tract of communication between the spinal cord and different regions of the body. So you can see how it extends. The spinal nerves are in pairs, so they arise from segment by segment. That is, you study the spinal nerves like segment by segment. Okay, so this is the important communication between the spinal cord and the regions of the body. It communicates between the spinal cord and the different regions of the body. So there are 31 pairs of spinal nerves which arise or which emerge from regular intervals. Okay, from the intervertebral foramen. There are intervertebral openings called as intervertebral foramen, through which the nerves come out of the spinal cord. So each pair of spinal nerve is arising from a spinal segment. So what are the 31 pairs? There are 8 pairs of cranial nerves. You can see that the cranial nerves, there are 8 pairs of cranial nerves, C1 to C8. And there are 12 pairs of thoracic nerves. You can see T1 to T12. 12 pairs of thoracic nerves and 5 pairs of lumbar nerves. You can see L1 to L5. So these are very important, present in the back region. So people suffering from back pain or some dislocation of the, they will experience some dislocation in these discs. Okay, L1 lumbar. So lumbar nerves, and 5 pairs of sacral nerves, S1 to S5, and 1 pair of coccygeal nerves. Okay, 1 pair of coccygeal nerves. So there are 31 pairs of nerves. Now we will see about the internal anatomy of the spinal cord. So you can see the internal anatomy of the spinal cord. This is the structure of the spinal cord, and internally you can see the gray matter, the H-shaped or the butterfly-shaped gray matter, and you can see the white matter is surrounding the gray matter. You can see the anterior fissure. Yeah, this is the anterior fissure, you can see, which goes inside, and this is the posterior sulcus. Okay, posterior sulcus you can see here, and you can see the spinal cord in the center. This is called as the central canal. So apart from this, you can see various roots. So these are the roots, and the smaller ones are called the rootlets. These are the, this is the ventral portion, and this is the dorsal portion. So you call it as the anterior, and this is the posterior. So this is the nerve. The one which is coming out of this is called as a nerve. So it comes out as the posterior as well as the anterior root. Okay, so this is the posterior or the dorsal root of the spinal nerve, and this is the anterior or the ventral root of the spinal nerve. They unite together to form the spinal nerve. And you can see some enlargement called as the ganglion. This is the posterior or the dorsal root ganglion. You can see one here and you can see one here. So these are the different ganglions, and this is the the root, anterior root, and this is the posterior root. You can see this on both sides, and you can see a lot of the cell bodies and the axons are present. You can see these are the sensory neurons, and this is the interneuron, and these are the motor neurons. So what do they do? So what the there are two bundles of axons. Okay, as I told you, roots, and the smaller bundle is called as the rootlets. They connect each spinal nerve to a segment. I told you, the spinal nerves are coming out from a segment. So by the segment of smaller bundles called the rootlets. So they are coming out in the form of rootlets. You can see these are the rootlets. Similarly, you can see the rootlets here. The anterior and the posterior nerves are coming out from the rootlets. So similarly, the posterior root and rootlets contain only sensory axons. You can see the posterior, they contain only the sensory axons. They conduct the nerve impulse from the sensory receptors in the skin. You can see here muscles and the internal organs into the central nervous system. This is the tract. The spinal cord of various segments are arranged one above the other, stacked in the vertebral column till they reach the brain. So that is a tract. So that will carry, this tract will carry the information from the peripheral regions of the body, or the skin, or the muscles, or the internal organs into the central nervous system. Gives information to the brain. So each posterior root has a swelling. As I told you, the root ganglion, here there is one and here there is one. This is called as the posterior or the dorsal root ganglion. This contain the, what does it contain? Cell body of the sensory neuron. Similarly, the anterior ventral or the ventral root, this one, contains axons of the motor neurons. So these contain axons of cell body of the sensory neurons. This contain axons of the ventral neurons. You can see the ganglion only in the posterior side. So this will conduct a nerve impulse from the central nervous system to the effector organs or the muscles. So these are the motor neurons. Okay, tract for the motor neurons. So what is a spinal nerve? A spinal nerve branches from the spinal cord. They pass laterally. So they pass laterally from the vertebral column through an opening called as the intervertebral foramina. So their intervertebral foramina are present adjacent between the adjacent vertebrae. So as you can see in the previous structure, the spinal cord is shorter than the vertebral column. So the nerves that arise from the lumbar sacral, in the previous slide you can see the nerves that arise, that is the spinal cord, because it is shorter than the vertebral column. The vertebral column continues till here. So what happens? The nerves that arise from the lumbar, sacral, and the coccygeal regions of the spinal cord, they do not leave the vertebral column at the same level as they exit the cord. The roots of these lower spinal nerves, they are present inferiorly along the side of the phylum terminal, and they are present here as a form of hair-like structures. Okay, tuft of hair-like structures, just like the horse's tail. They present like the horse's tail. So horse, it is called as cauda equina, because it represents the horse tail. It is called as the cauda equina or the horse tail. So these are the structures you have to remember. That is the different regions of the spinal cord. This is a single spinal cord. The interior gray matter and the exterior outermost white matter, and this is the dorsal side, and this is the ventral side. Dorsal side is called as the posterior, and the ventral side is called as the anterior. The white column is also separated like this: the posterior white column, anterior white column, and the lateral white column. So these are the different columns. Similarly, the that is the nerves emerging, they have posterior root. This is the posterior root. So they combine, emerge out as rootlets. Okay, anterior rootlets and the posterior rootlets, they come out and they form a posterior or the dorsal root of the spinal nerve. This is the anterior root of the spinal nerve. They combine together to form the final spinal nerve. Okay, so here the ganglion is the area where the cell body of the sensory neurons are present, and the uh, here that is the anterior region, it is a region where the axons of the motor neurons are present. This carry information from the cells, that is the different parts of the body, skin, muscles and the other organs, to the brain, okay, through the interneurons. This we will study in the next few slides. And the anterior ventral root, they contain, the axons of the motor neurons. What do? They conduct nerve impulse from the central nervous system to the effector organs. So this is, they come out through the foramina, intervertebral foramina, which are present in between the adjacent vertebrae. So these are the things you have to remember. So here you can see how the gray matter are present. It is a This shows a transverse section of the spinal cord. So it shows a white matter. See, white matter is enlarged, is more than the gray matter, and the gray matter is present in the inner core. Inside you can see the central canal through which the spinal cord passes, and you can see this is the anterior median fissure, and this is the posterior median sulcus. And the white matter is divided into posterior white column, anterior white column, lateral white column. Similarly, the gray matter is also called as horn. This is the posterior gray horn, and this is the anterior gray horn, and this is the lateral gray horn. So they are very important. For the nerve, that is, they act as tract. Okay, they act as tract. They are continuous with all the vertebrae till it reaches the brain. These tracts pass on the information from different parts of the body to the brain, and the motor neurons, the anterior roots, they carry the information order from the brain to the different parts of the body through the tracts. So you can see the gray matter, they contain clusters of neuronal cell bodies. They are called as the nuclei. So in the gray matter contains clusters of neuronal cell bodies which form functional groups called as nuclei. So sensory nuclei, what do you know about sensory nuclei? Interneurons and motor neurons. Sensory nuclei receive input from the receptors via sensory neurons, and motor nuclei provide output to the effector tissue via the motor neurons. So these two are connected together by the interneurons. Now let us see about the organization of the spinal cord. So as I told you, these are the tracts. This region is called as the sensory tract, and this region is called as the motor descending. The sensory tracts are ascending from bottom to top to the brain, and the motor neurons, see here, these are the sensory. This side and this side, they contain the sensory ascending tract, and these contain the descending motor tract. So let us see the organization, how the processing of the sensory input. Sensory input is processed, and how the motor output is given by the spinal cord. So sensory input is conveyed from the sensory receptors to posterior gray horns of the spinal cord, whereas motor output is conveyed from the anterior and the lateral gray horns of the spinal cord to the effector muscles and glands. So let us see one by one. So number one, what are the sensory receptors? So sensory receptors are present in the skin and the different peripheral regions of the body. So they detect the sensory stimulus. Then what do? So these sensory neurons convey the sensory input in the form of nerve impulse along their axons, which extend from the sensory receptors into the spinal nerve. You can see this is the spinal nerve which enters through the spinal nerve, and they go, this is the posterior or the ventral root. From the posterior root, the axons travel of the sensory neuron may travel along three routes. Okay, and the three possible routes are here, 3, 4, and 5. So, what are the three routes? That is what we are going to see. So, this one, the axons of the sensory neurons will extend into the white matter. So, the sensory neuron axon will enter into the white matter of the spinal cord, and then they ascend to the brain as a part of the sensory tract. As I told you, as a part of the sensory tract, they ascend to the brain. Whereas the next tract is the next one is the axons of the sensory neuron may enter the posterior gray horn, and they will connect with the interneurons, synapse with the interneurons, whose axons extend into the white matter of the spinal cord. You can see it extends to the white matter of the spinal cord. And then again, this is also another sensory tract. They ascend to the brain as a part of the sensory tract. The other route is the fifth one. So axons of the sensory neurons may enter the posterior gray horn and synapse with the interneurons, which in turn will synapse with the somatic motor neurons. Here you can see motor neurons that are involved in the spinal reflex pathways. Okay, so this is the next route. Now what happens? Here, the motor output from the spinal cord, from the brain, okay, to the skeletal muscles is given by the motor descending tract. Okay, by the motor descending tract. So this will enter the gray horn. You can see this will enter. This will come down. That is the. It involves the somatic motor neurons of the anterior gray horn. See, it enters through the anterior gray horn. So axons from the higher brain centers from motor tract descend from the brain into the white matter. You can see it enters the white matter of the spinal cord. Here they synapse with the somatic motor neurons. They later synapse with the somatic motor neuron. This is the somatic motor neuron, either directly or through the interneurons. Then it will synapse with the somatic motor neurons. Okay, so either directly or indirectly, and then it will activate this will get activated. So somatic motor neuron convey the motor output or the instructions of the brain in the form of nerve impulses throughout the axon, which will pass through the anterior gray horn and and to the anterior root. You can see this is the root, and it will enter the spinal nerve and come out. Okay, it will extend to the skeletal muscles, skeletal and the effector muscles. The other one is, motor output from the spinal cord. It will affect the cardiac muscles, smooth muscles, and the other internal organs of the body. So this involves the autonomic nervous system. So autonomic nervous system, which is called as the autonomic motor neurons of the. This comes out through the lateral horn of the gray matter. So when this is activated, motor neurons, that is the autonomic motor neurons, convey the order from the motor output from the brain, okay, through the nerves. You can see it passes through the nerves and enters the anterior root and comes out, and it will affect the heart and the other internal organs of the body. The last one, you can see from the spinal nerve, what happens? The atoms of the axons of the autonomic motor neurons from the spinal cord synapse with another group of autonomic motor neurons. This is the peripheral nervous system. This is called as the peripheral nervous system. So this axons of the second group will in turn synapse with the cardiac muscles. Okay, so the smooth muscles and the internal organs, and they will activate them. So this is the process of sensory input. That is sensory input from the sensory receptors. Okay, how it is passed into the nerve. Okay, into the spinal nerve and enters as the sensory neurons, and how they synapse, and the information is given to the brain through the sensory ascending tract on both sides, and the motor descending tract will give the order, and how they synapse in various regions of the anterior gray horn and the lateral gray horns, and it will activate the receptor muscles present in the skeletal system, as well as the autonomic nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. So this is how it will act. So various spinal cord, the segments of the various spinal cord are not the same throughout. It will vary in the size, the shape, and the relative amount of gray matter and the white matter. It is not the same. The distribution of the gray matter and the white matter is different. The shape is also different. That is what is shown here. You can see this is the comparison of various spinal cord segments. This is the cervical segment. So here you can see it contains large amount of diameter. That is, it bigger in size, large diameter, and it contains large amount of white matter, and it is oval in shape. So it is in the upper cervical segment C1 to C4. So here you can see the gray horn is large. Okay, the posterior gray horn is large, but the anterior gray horn is relatively small. Um, so small in lower cervical segments, that is C5 and below. Posterior gray horns are enlarged and anterior gray horns are well developed. Okay, this is the thoracic segment, and you can see the diameter is very small because the gray matter is also very small. The white matter is larger than the gray matter, except for the first thoracic segment. Anterior and posterior gray horns are relatively small. A small lateral gray horn is present. This is the lumbar segment. Here it is not like these like oval. It is nearly circular, very large anterior and posterior gray horns. You can see anterior and posterior gray horns are larger. A small lateral gray horn is present in the upper segments, relatively less white matter than cervical segment. When you compare it with the cervical segment, the white matter is comparatively less. The sacral segments, they are also relatively small when you compare with all the other segments, but a large amount of gray matter is present here. And unlike the other ones, the white matter is relatively little. Okay, anterior and posterior gray horns are large and thick. Whereas the coccygeal segment, they resemble the lower sacral spinal segment but smaller. So that is why the segments are not the same from top to bottom. So the amount of white matter decreases from cervical to the sacral segments of the spinal cord. So more sensory and motor tracts are present in the upper segments of the spinal cord than in the lower segments. So the variation in the spinal cord may be because the spinal cord ascends from the sacral to the cervical segments. More ascending axons are added to the spinal cord white matter to form sensory tracts. That is why the white matter is more in the lower segments than the upper segments. So as the sensory cord descends from the cervical to the sacral last segments, the motor tract, that is, it is more of motor tract are present here in the upper ones, cervical ones, than the lower ones. So that is why the motor tract decreases in thickness from upper to lower. Okay, as more descending axons leave the motor tracts to synapse with the neurons in the gray matter of the spinal cord. So this is the reason why there is a difference in the shape and size and the amount of gray and white matter on the of the various segments of the spinal cord. Hope you understood the anatomy of the spinal cord, the various organization of the spinal cord, the segment, and how the nerve is the spinal nerve is emerging out of the vertebral column, each and every vertebrae, and also what are the different types of spinal nerves. There are 31 pairs of spinal nerves present. So in the next class, we will study about the spinal nerves.